When Big Shaq walks into McDonald's as a homeless man, the world doesn't see a legend, only a problem to be removed. Ignored, rejected, and humiliated, Big Shaq faces the brutal truth of a system built to break the forgotten. But when the disguise comes off, the shocking ending will leave everyone speechless. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Shaquille O'Neal was a household name, one of the greatest basketball players to ever step on the court, a millionaire, a businessman, and a beloved public figure. Fans saw him as a giant in every sense, both in size and in personality. He was always the guy cracking jokes, making people laugh, handing out surprises, and lifting others up. To the world, he was Big Shaq, the larger-than-life celebrity. But inside, he was just Shaq, a man with a heart that felt heavier with every injustice he witnessed. Lately, something had been weighing on him more than usual. No matter where he went, whether it was Los Angeles, Atlanta, or even the city he called home, he saw them. The people society had forgotten. The ones huddled under freeway bridges, sleeping on cardboard, sitting outside fast food restaurants with nothing but a cup of old coffee and a distant stare. Homelessness wasn't just rising, it was exploding. The gap between the rich and the poor had widened into a canyon, and Shaq felt like he was standing on the wrong side, looking down at people he didn't know how to help. One night, he was driving through downtown in his Escalade, passing through an area he knew most of his friends wouldn't dare enter. The streets were littered with old newspapers, broken bottles, and the forgotten remnants of people's lives. He saw a man curled up against a bus stop bench, a threadbare hoodie barely covering his shivering body. Across the street, a mother clutched her young daughter's hand as they sat on the cold pavement, a sign beside them that read, "We just need a chance." Shaq's heart twisted. He had seen these scenes before, on TV, in headlines, in passing. But tonight, it hit different. Maybe it was the way the little girl was staring at her mother, confused but trusting. Maybe it was the way no one stopped, not even to glance in their direction. Maybe it was the fact that he could do something about it, but hadn't. He had always been generous. He had paid for strangers' meals, covered hospital bills, even bought entire houses for struggling families. But now, as he sat there, his hands gripping the steering wheel, he realized something deeply unsettling. He had never truly understood their pain. Helping from a distance wasn't the same as feeling the cold at night. Giving out money wasn't the same as knowing what it meant to have nothing. He had spent his life being protected by his wealth, by his fame, by the simple fact that people knew his name. But what if they didn't? What if, for once, he wasn't Big Shaq? What if he was just another man on the streets? That night, Shaq couldn't sleep. His California king bed felt too soft, his mansion too quiet, his wealth too heavy. He tossed and turned, his mind racing with thoughts of that mother and her child, of the man on the bench, of the countless faces he had passed without a second thought. By 3 a.m., he was pacing his living room. The idea had planted itself so firmly in his brain that he couldn't shake it. He had to go undercover. It sounded crazy. It was crazy, but it was the only way to truly understand. He needed to feel the hunger, the loneliness, the rejection. He needed to see what the world looked like from the bottom. There was no hesitation, only determination. Shaq walked over to his security monitors and clicked through the different angles of his sprawling home. The irony hit him like a punch to the gut. He had 8 bedrooms, and just outside his gates, people were sleeping on concrete. He grabbed his phone and called the one person he knew would keep this a secret. "Hey man, I need a favor," he said. His voice was steady, but his heart was pounding. "Shaq?" "It's 3 in the morning." His longtime friend and stylist DeAndre groaned on the other end. "What's up?" "I need you to make me disappear." There was silence, then a confused chuckle. "What?" "I'm serious. I need clothes, I need a disguise, and I need to look like I've been on the streets for months. Can you do it?" Another pause, then a sigh. "Bro, I don't even know how to respond to that. You trying to fake your own death or something?" Shaq ran a hand over his bald head, exhaling. "I need to understand. The people out there, the ones living in the streets, I need to know what they go through. I can't do that as me. DeAndre was quiet for a long time before finally saying, "All right, you're crazy, but I'll help. When do you need this?" "Tomorrow." A low whistle. "Damn, you don't waste time, huh?" Shaq shook his head, though DeAndre couldn't see him. "Nah, man. Not when people are freezing out there tonight." The next day, DeAndre showed up with a duffel bag filled with secondhand clothes, old jeans, a ragged hoodie, scuffed sneakers that looked 2 sizes too small. Shaq inspected the clothes, nodding. They smelled like sweat and cigarette smoke. Perfect. "All right, big man," DeAndre said, crossing his arms. "You ready to say goodbye to the VIP treatment?" Shaq smirked, slipping on the hoodie. "Been ready." Over the next hour, DeAndre worked his magic. He smeared dirt on Shaq's face, added streaks of gray to his beard, and even gave him fake scars using a makeup kit. By the time he was done, Shaq didn't recognize himself. "Damn," he muttered, staring in the mirror. He looked old, worn out. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a man who had clearly been through hell and back. DeAndre stepped back, rubbing his chin. "If I didn't know better, I'd swear you've been homeless for years. You sure about this, though? Once you step outside, there's no 5-star treatment waiting for you." Shaq nodded. "That's the point." Before leaving, he emptied his pockets of everything. His wallet, his phone, even his watch. The only thing he took was $5 in loose change. As soon as he stepped out of his mansion's gates, the air felt different. The world was the same, but Shaq wasn't. People didn't look at him the same way. The usual waves, smiles, and whispers of "that's Shaq" were gone. No one recognized him. No one cared. He walked through the streets, his stomach twisting with unease. He had always been noticed. His size alone made that impossible to avoid. But today he wasn't just unnoticed, he was invisible. By the time he reached downtown, the reality of his decision was sinking in fast. The sun was setting, and the streets were growing colder. He had nowhere to go, no one to call, and only $5 to his name. For the first time in his life, Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq, the millionaire, the icon, the unstoppable force, was just another nameless man in a sea of forgotten faces. And he was about to learn exactly what that meant. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting an orange glow over the city as Shaq walked through streets he had only ever driven past. He could feel eyes flickering toward him, some cautious, some indifferent. His disguise was working. No one saw Shaquille O'Neal, the millionaire, the celebrity, the legend. They saw just another man with nowhere to go. His oversized frame, which once made him an unstoppable force on the court, now made him stick out in a different way. His clothes, tattered jeans, a faded hoodie, and old sneakers that pressed painfully against his toes, made it clear he wasn't someone to admire. He was someone to ignore. The transformation wasn't just physical. He had to change his presence, too. No more towering confidence. No more easy smiles. No more striding with purpose. He had to shrink himself, keep his head low, move like a man who had been beaten down by life. The weight of it pressed on him heavier than any championship ring ever had. He made his way deeper into the city, toward an area known for poverty, struggle, and broken dreams. The streets were different here. Cracked sidewalks, flickering streetlights, and an air of quiet desperation. Outside an old liquor store, a man in a stained jacket sat on the curb, mumbling to himself. His fingers were wrapped around a paper bag, shaking slightly. Shaq slowed his pace. "You look lost," the man muttered without looking up. Shaq hesitated. Was he lost? In a way, he was. "Just passing through," he finally said, keeping his voice low, rougher than usual. The man let out a short laugh, bitter and hollow. "Ain't nobody just passing through here. You either stuck, or you running from something." Shaq said nothing. He simply nodded and walked on, feeling the weight of those words settle deep in his chest. Further down the street, he saw them. The forgotten ones. A group of men and women huddled in an alleyway, surrounded by torn blankets, makeshift tents, and bags stuffed with whatever little they owned. Some were talking in hushed voices. Others sat in silence, staring at the world as it moved past them. unseen and unnoticed. For the first time, Shaq felt something he had never felt before. He was on the outside looking in. A sharp gust of wind cut through his hoodie, sending a chill down his spine. He pulled it tighter, but it didn't help much. The air carried a mix of scents: stale food, unwashed clothes, the bitter stench of cheap alcohol. This was survival, raw and unfiltered. A woman in her late 40s sat near a dumpster, rocking slightly as she whispered to herself. Her clothes were thin, her fingers blue from the cold. Shaq watched as a younger man, probably in his 20s, walked up to her, crouched down, and gently placed a half-eaten burger in her lap. She didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge him. She just clutched the food like it was the only thing, anchoring her to this world. Shaq's stomach twisted. He had spent thousands of dollars on dinners, left $100 tips without thinking twice. He had never seen food treated like a lifeline before. He took a deep breath and kept walking. He didn't belong here. Not yet. The sign glowed in the distance. A 24-hour McDonald's. Shaq had done his research before coming out here. He knew that fast food restaurants were often the only warm places the homeless could go at night. They weren't shelters, but they had heat, light, and, if you were lucky, staff who didn't kick you out right away. The inside smelled of fryer grease and stale coffee. The bright fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, washing everything in a pale yellow glow. The restaurant was half full, mostly night shift workers grabbing a meal before heading to their next job. But in the corners, near the windows, sat the ones who had nowhere else to go. Shaq spotted an older man slumped in a booth, his clothes layered and bulky, a shopping cart filled with bags parked beside him. Across from him, a teenage boy sat with his head down, dozing off with an empty tray in front of him. Shaq approached the counter, feeling eyes on him. The cashier, a young man in his early 20s, glanced at him but didn't offer the usual "welcome to McDonald's" greeting. Instead, his expression shifted, cautious, slightly annoyed. Shaq pulled the crumpled $5 bill from his pocket. Just a coffee. The cashier raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. He punched in the order, took the money, and handed Shaq a small, steaming cup. No, have a nice day. Just a transaction. Shaq took a seat near the window, wrapping his hands around the cup. The warmth seeped into his fingers, a luxury he had never thought twice about before. A few minutes passed. A manager, a woman in her late 40s with a stern expression, walked out from the back. Her eyes scanned the restaurant, landing on the man with the shopping cart. She sighed and walked over. "You can't sleep here, Henry," she said, her voice flat, practiced. The old man stirred, blinking groggily. "Just resting my eyes." "You know the rules," she said, crossing her arms. "If you're not buying anything, you can't stay." Shaq felt a flash of irritation. Where was he supposed to go? Henry grumbled under his breath but slowly stood, gathering his bags. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if hoping she would change her mind. She didn't. As Henry pushed his cart toward the door, Shaq caught his gaze. Defeat. That's what he saw. Not anger, not rebellion. Just a quiet, tired acceptance. Shaq exhaled, staring down at his coffee. He had never been told to leave a place in his life. He had always been the VIP, the guest of honor, the man people wanted around. Tonight he was just another burden. First time? The voice came from across the table. Shaq looked up to see a man sitting in the booth next to him. Late 50s, salt and pepper beard, sharp eyes that had clearly seen too much. "First time what?" Shaq asked. The man smirked. "First time being treated like a problem." Shaq hesitated, then nodded. He wasn't sure why, but lying didn't feel right. The man studied him. "You don't talk like the rest of us. You don't sit like the rest of us either." Shaq shifted in his seat. "How do the rest of you sit?" The man shrugged. "Like we're waiting to be kicked out." He leaned forward. "You're not really homeless, are you?" Shaq's heart pounded. Had he already blown his cover? He struggled for words. The man chuckled. "Relax, I ain't gonna rat you out. Just saying you look lost." Shaq exhaled, gripping his coffee cup. "Maybe I am." The man nodded slowly, as if he understood something Shaq didn't. "Well, Get ready. The world looks real different from down here. Shaq didn't respond. He just stared out the window, watching as Henry disappeared into the cold, pushing his cart toward nowhere. And for the first time, Shaquille O'Neal, the millionaire, the celebrity, the icon, felt something he had never felt before. Small. Shaq had been in uncomfortable situations before. High-pressure games, brutal training sessions, business meetings where millions were on the line. But none of those compared to this. As soon as he stepped through the glass doors of the McDonald's, he could feel it. The shift in energy. The air inside was thick with fryer grease and the sharp sting of disinfectant. But beneath it was something more familiar. Something colder. Judgment. He wasn't Big Shaq anymore. He was just another unwanted presence. Shaq kept his head down, gripping his small cup of coffee as he moved toward the same corner booth he had occupied earlier. The moment he sat, he felt the first wave of stares. Some were quick, just a glance before turning back to their phones or food. Others lingered, eyes narrowing as if trying to figure him out. A few tables away, a man in a cheap business suit frowned before shifting his tray closer, as if afraid Shaq might reach over and steal a fry. Near the counter, two employees whispered to each other. Shaq couldn't hear what they were saying, but he didn't need to. He knew that look. He had seen it before, on security guards trailing people in high-end stores, on restaurant hosts hesitating before seating certain customers. It was the silent, unspoken suspicion that followed people who didn't look like they belonged. He had never been on the receiving end of it. Until now. A voice broke through his thoughts. "Hey man, you planning to order anything else?" Shaq looked up to see a young cashier, barely in his 20s, standing by his booth. His name tag read, Kyle. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable, but his tone was clear. Not friendly, not welcoming. Shaq took a slow sip of his coffee. "I already ordered." Kyle exhaled through his nose. "Yeah, but you've been here a while." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "So?" Kyle shifted on his feet. "We got rules, you know, about loitering." Shaq studied him. The words weren't his. They were something he had been told to say, something drilled into him by a manager who didn't want certain people hanging around. Shaq could have snapped back, could have pulled rank in a way that would make Kyle deeply regret talking to him like that. But that wasn't why he was here. So instead, he simply nodded. "I get it." Kyle hesitated, like he was waiting for a fight that never came. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward the counter. Shaq exhaled, running a hand over his face. This was step one. The first test. The first taste of what it meant to be seen as a problem instead of a person. But he wasn't the only one. Across the room, he watched as a woman in her 60s slowly made her way to a booth, her thin frame drowning in layers of mismatched clothing. She had a small tray in her hands, a single small coffee, just like his. She hadn't even sat down before another employee, a shift manager this time, swooped in. "Ma'am, you can't stay here unless you're eating." Her voice was firm but not loud, not enough to draw attention from other paying customers, but just enough to make it clear. The old woman blinked up at her. "I bought a coffee." The manager, a woman with blonde hair pulled into a tight ponytail, sighed. "You can't stay long." The woman just nodded. She didn't argue. She just lowered herself into the seat, hands wrapped around the cup like it was the last bit of warmth in the world. Shaq clenched his jaw. They weren't even trying to hide it. 15 minutes passed, then 30. The dinner rush had come and gone, and now the McDonald's had settled into a lull. Shaq noticed that Kyle and the other employees weren't bothering anyone else. A teenage couple had been sitting in the same spot for over an hour, their fries long gone, scrolling through their phones. A businessman sat near the window, his laptop open, typing away without any food in front of him. No one had asked them to leave. But Shaq knew it was only a matter of time before they came for him again. And he was right. The same manager who had spoken to the old woman approached his booth, her expression set. "Sir," she said, her voice clipped, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Shaq leaned back. "Why?" "You've been here too long," she said, folding her arms. "And you're not eating." Shaq gestured to his coffee. "Still drinking this?" She didn't blink. "We have policies." Shaq exhaled through his nose. He had seen enough. "You mean you have different policies for different people?" he said, his voice steady. The manager stiffened. "Excuse me?" Shaq motioned around the room. "I've been watching. There's a guy over there working on his laptop, not eating. Nobody's asking him to leave. There's a couple over there. Haven't touched their food in half an hour. But me, the old woman, we get the warnings." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Sir, I'm not going to argue with you." "You don't have to," Shaq said, standing. "I'll leave." She looked relieved, but Shaq wasn't done yet. As he stepped toward the door, he passed the old woman's table. Her coffee was gone, the cup turned upside down, but she was still sitting there. The manager's voice followed. "Ma'am, I need you to—" Shaq stopped. He turned. "Let her be," he said, his voice quiet but firm. The manager hesitated. "Sir, this isn't your concern." "It is now," Shaq said. The old woman looked up at him, confusion flickering across her tired eyes. She didn't recognize him. Nobody did. That was the point. For the first time, Shaq truly understood. It didn't matter how kind you were. It didn't matter what you had been through. If you looked like you had nothing, people treated you like you were nothing. The manager sighed. "Sir, please." Shaq turned back to her, meeting her eyes. "I hope you never end up on the other side of this," he said. "Because when you do, you'll remember nights like this. And you'll remember how easy it was for you to decide who gets to stay warm and who gets left out in the cold." She didn't answer. Shaq walked toward the door. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Because he already knew what he would see. A world that was too comfortable letting people disappear. Shaq sat at the farthest booth in the dimly lit McDonald's, his fingers still wrapped around the now lukewarm cup of coffee. The weight of the night pressed down on him, heavier than anything he had ever lifted in the gym. He had seen rejection before, but not like this. Not the slow, crushing kind that came in whispers, side glances, and rules that only applied to people who had nothing. But as he sat there, feeling the chill of being unwanted, something unexpected happened. Someone noticed him. From the corner of his eye, Shaq saw a man watching him, not with suspicion, not with judgment, just watching. The man was older, mid-50s maybe, with deep lines in his face and a slow, deliberate way of moving. His janitor uniform was worn, the navy blue fabric faded in places, the name tag hanging loosely from one side. Shaq saw him grab a fresh cup from behind the counter, pour steaming coffee into it, and walk toward him. The man stopped at Shaq's table, setting the cup down gently. "You look like you could use a hot one," he said, sliding into the seat across from him. Shaq looked at the cup, then at the man. "I already got one," he muttered. The janitor smirked, nodding at Shaq's nearly empty cup. "Yeah, but that one's got more backwash than coffee now." Shaq huffed a quiet laugh despite himself. He took the new cup, the warmth soaking into his fingertips, and took a slow sip. The janitor leaned back in the booth. "Name's Jesse." Shaq hesitated. He couldn't say Shaq. Not here. Not now. "Lenny," he said, pulling the name out of thin air. Jesse raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Lenny, huh? Ain't never met a 7-foot Lenny before." Shaq just shrugged. Jesse exhaled, stretching his sore shoulders. "Ain't my business, though. I don't ask questions when I see someone down on their luck. But I do know one thing. You ain't been doing this long." Shaq frowned. "What makes you say that?" Jesse smirked. "Your clothes are dirty, but not worn out. You sit too straight. You ain't learned how to disappear yet." Shaq didn't know what to say to that. Jesse tapped the side of his cup. "Me? I've been watching people come through here for years. You learn to tell the difference. The ones who've been out here long enough, they don't hold their heads up no more. They don't take up space, they shrink. You ain't learned how to shrink yet." Shaq stared into his coffee, the words sinking in. He hadn't thought about it that way. He had always been the biggest presence in any room. But now, for the first time, that wasn't an advantage. It was a dead giveaway. Jesse took another sip of his coffee, watching Shaq carefully. "You played ball, didn't you?" Shaq's stomach tightened. "What makes you say that?" Jesse grinned. "Man, look at you. Ain't no way you weren't built for it." Shaq forced himself to smirk. "Yeah, a long time ago." Jesse nodded, as if he understood. Same here. Thought I was gonna make it. Thought the world was gonna know my name. Shaq looked up. Jesse's gaze was distant now, his fingers tracing the rim of his cup. Played college ball back in the day. Wasn't no superstar, but I held my own. Had scouts watching me, agents whispering about a future in the league. Shaq could see it now, the way Jesse carried himself, the way his hands moved like they had once gripped a ball every day of his life. What happened? Shaq asked. Jesse let out a slow breath. Blew out my knee senior year. No money for the surgery. No second chances. Shaq felt that deep in his chest. Jesse shook his head, forcing a small smile. Took me a long time to get over it. Maybe I never did. Worked whatever jobs I could find. Construction, warehouses, janitorial gigs. Ain't glamorous, but it keeps the lights on. Shaq swallowed. He had met a lot of former players who had seen their dreams crumble. Some lost their way, some never recovered. And some, like Jesse, just kept going. Do you still love the game? Shaq asked. Jesse chuckled. Man, love ain't got nothing to do with it. It's just something that stays with you, whether you want it to or not. Shaq nodded slowly. He knew exactly what that felt like. The door chimed, and Shaq glanced up. A young woman walked in, shaking the cold from her thin jacket. She moved quickly, her ponytail swaying as she stepped behind the counter and tied on an apron. She looked tired, not just physically, but in the deep, worn-down way that came from too many struggles and not enough hope. That's Elena, Jesse said, following Shaq's gaze. Works 2 jobs, single mom. Comes here after her shift at the laundromat. Barely sleeps, but she still smiles at customers like they tip more than a handful of change. Shaq watched as Elena clocked in, tying her apron with practiced efficiency before heading to the register. She caught Jesse's eye and gave him a small nod. Hey, Jesse. Hey, kid, Jesse replied. Elena barely looked at Shaq, but something changed in the air when she passed his table. She didn't make eye contact. She didn't acknowledge him. But 5 minutes later, when she walked by again, something small slid across the table toward him. A wrapped cheeseburger. Shaq looked up, but Elena was already walking away, pretending it hadn't happened. Jesse smirked. Told you, she's got a soft spot for folks like you. Shaq stared at the burger, something tightening in his throat. He wasn't hungry. Not really. But that wasn't the point. This was something bigger than food. It was a message. She didn't know him. She didn't owe him anything. But she had seen him sitting there, assumed the worst, and decided, on her own, that he deserved kindness. Shaq swallowed. People like Elena, people like Jesse, they were the ones holding the world together. Not the millionaires, not the CEOs, just regular people with tired eyes and good hearts, doing what they could for others who had even less. Shaq unwrapped the burger, the paper crinkling in his hands. Jesse watched him for a moment before leaning back in his seat. You know, most folks out here don't expect much. A little kindness goes a long way. Shaq nodded. He knew Jesse was right. But kindness wasn't just about food. It was about how people saw you. Shaq had spent his life being admired, respected, welcomed, and all it had taken was one night, one disguise to become invisible. And yet, in that invisibility, he had found the people who mattered. Not the ones who turned away. Not the ones who made excuses. But the ones who saw past the dirt, past the worn-out clothes, past the expectations. People like Jesse, people like Elena. The kind of people the world ignored, but who still refused to ignore the world. Shaq took a bite of the burger. It was the best meal he'd had in years. Shaq had never thought of McDonald's as a battleground before. Growing up, it had been a place of comfort, a place where kids laughed over Happy Meals, where families stopped after church, where late-night drives ended with a hot burger and fries. But tonight, under the cold glare of fluorescent lights, it felt different. Tonight, it wasn't a restaurant. It was a line in the sand, one that divided those who had something from those who had nothing. And Shaq was about to see exactly how deep that divide went. The first sign of trouble came with the slam of the door. Shaq looked up just as 2 uniformed police officers walked in. They weren't here for food. They weren't here for a casual check-in. They were here on a mission. Their eyes swept over the restaurant, searching. For what? Shaq didn't have to wonder for long. "Here we go," Jesse muttered, setting down his mop and wiping his hands on his uniform. Shaq followed the officer's gaze toward the farthest booth in the corner. A man was sleeping there, his arms folded, his head resting against the wall. Shaq had seen him earlier. A man in his late 50s, dressed in layers of old jackets. A backpack stuffed with everything he owned sitting beside him. He wasn't bothering anyone. He wasn't causing a scene. He had just dozed off, the exhaustion of the streets finally catching up to him. And that, apparently, was a crime. One of the officers, a tall man with a buzz cut, walked up to the booth and tapped the man's shoulder. "Sir, you can't sleep here." The man stirred, blinking in confusion. He looked around, as if trying to remember where he was. "Come on," the officer said, a little firmer this time. "Time to go." The man sat up, rubbing his face. I wasn't causing no trouble." The second officer, younger and more impatient, stepped forward. "That doesn't matter. You gotta leave." Shaq felt something hot rise in his chest. This ain't right. Before he could speak, Jesse muttered, "Don't get involved." Shaq turned to him. "You okay with this?" Jesse sighed. "Ain't about being okay with it. It's about knowing how this ends." Shaq clenched his jaw. He knew what Jesse meant. The man wasn't getting a choice. The older man looked at the officers, then at the restaurant. His shoulders slumped. He grabbed his backpack, wincing as he stood. All right, he mumbled, shuffling toward the door. Shaq could see it in his face. Shame, not anger, not defiance. Just the quiet, beaten-down acceptance of a man who was used to being told he didn't belong. The officers followed him out. The door slammed shut behind them. Just like that, he was gone. The tension in the air hadn't even settled before it flared up again. Across the restaurant, a man in a crisp suit let out an exaggerated sigh. He had been watching the entire scene unfold, his expression twisted with disgust. He turned in his seat, eyes locking onto Shaq. "You should be next," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Shaq's muscles tensed. "What?" The man gestured toward the door. "They should have taken you with him." Shaq stared at him, his blood simmering. The man shook his head, pushing his tray away like he had lost his appetite. "I don't know why places like this let people like you hang around. It's bad for business." Shaq felt Jesse's hand on his arm. "Don't take the bait," he warned. Shaq took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay seated. "You got a problem with me drinking my coffee?" he asked, keeping his voice even. The man scoffed. "You're not a customer. You're a freeloader." Shaq leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Pretty sure my money spent the same as yours." The man narrowed his eyes, opening his mouth to fire back. "Everything okay here?" A new voice cut through the tension. Shaq turned, and immediately knew things were about to get worse. The woman standing near the counter wasn't just another employee. Her posture, her tailored business suit, the clipboard tucked under her arm, it all screamed one thing: authority. Jesse groaned under his breath. District manager. Shaq didn't need to ask what that meant. She was the boss, the one who made the rules. And judging by the icy look in her eyes, she wasn't happy. She walked past the man in the suit, barely sparing him a glance, and stopped in front of Jesse. "I need a word with you. Now." Jesse sighed and followed her toward the back. Shaq's stomach twisted. This wasn't about Jesse. This was about what had just happened. A few minutes later, Jesse came back, his face unreadable. Shaq waited until he sat down. "What did she say?" Jesse exhaled. "Told me I need to stop getting friendly with the wrong kind of customers." Shaq's fists clenched. "The wrong kind?" Jesse nodded. "Said I should focus on my job and let security handle the problems." Shaq's jaw tightened. By problems, she meant people. Jesse didn't answer. He didn't have to. Shaq looked toward the counter. The district manager was speaking with Kyle now, probably reminding him of the rules, the ones that only applied to certain people. And then, as if the night hadn't already been ugly enough, the door opened, and in walked the last person Shaq expected. The man had military posture, even though he walked with a limp. His coat was old, his beard unkempt, but Shaq could see the remnants of discipline in the way he carried himself. Jesse exhaled. "That's Miller." Shaq turned. "You know him?" Jesse nodded. "Used to come in here a lot. Then they banned him." Shaq frowned. "Why?" "Because he kept asking for water." Shaq's stomach sank. They watched as Miller walked up to the counter, pulling a handful of coins from his pocket. He set them down carefully, his hands shaking slightly. "Coffee," he said, his voice rough. "Black." Kyle hesitated. He glanced toward the back where the district manager stood, watching. And then, "I can't serve you." Silence. Miller frowned. "I got money." Kyle swallowed. "Yeah, but we can't serve you." Shaq's hands curled into fists. Miller stared at the coins on the counter. He had money. He wasn't asking for a handout. He wasn't begging. And still they were turning him away. For a long moment, he just stood there. Then, without a word, he picked up his coins, turned, and walked out. Shaq couldn't take it anymore. He stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the tile. The district manager turned to him, her expression sharp. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to sit down." Shaq ignored her. He looked toward Jesse. "You said kindness goes a long way, right?" Jesse nodded slowly. Shaq exhaled. Time to see how far. Without another word, he walked out after Miller. Jesse watched him go, shaking his head. "Man," he muttered. "I don't know who you are, but you sure ain't normal." And inside, the district manager stared after Shaq, suspicion flickering in her eyes. She didn't know it yet, but her entire world was about to change. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of asphalt and distant fast food grease. Shaq stepped outside the McDonald's, his breath visible in the cold. His mind was still spinning from what he had just witnessed. A disabled veteran refused service, an old man thrown out like garbage, a district manager enforcing cruelty like it was just another task on her checklist. His hands clenched at his sides. This wasn't about one bad restaurant or one cruel manager. This was bigger. This was systemic. And Shaq was done being a silent observer. Hearing the unheard Miller, the veteran, was already halfway down the sidewalk, walking with slow, deliberate steps. Shaq picked up his pace, falling in beside him. "You shouldn't have followed me," Miller muttered without looking up. Shaq ignored that. "You all right?" Miller let out a dry chuckle. "You tell me." They walked in silence for a moment. Then, with a tired sigh, Miller finally stopped and turned to face him. "You new to this?" he asked. Shaq hesitated. "What makes you say that?" Miller snorted. "You walk like you expect people to move out of your way. Out here, that don't happen." Shaq exhaled. He had been seen through again. First Jesse, now Miller. "Yeah," he admitted. "I'm new." Miller nodded as if he already knew the answer. "Let me tell you something, new guy. It don't matter how you ended up here. Could be bad luck, bad choices, or just bad people making decisions about your life. In the end, nobody cares. You could be a war vet, a mother, a college grad. It don't matter. The second you're out here, you're invisible." Shaq listened, absorbing every word. "You know how many times I've been arrested?" Miller continued. "Not for stealing, not for fighting, not for drugs. Just for being here. For sitting on a bench too long. For sleeping where people could see me. For asking for water." Shaq's stomach twisted. Miller shook his head. "People think being homeless means you ain't trying. But tell me, how do you get back on your feet when the whole system is built to knock you down?" Shaq had no answer, because Miller was right. Over the next 2 hours, Shaq walked the streets, talking to people he would have never even noticed before. There was Tasha, a single mother who had lost her apartment after medical bills piled up from her daughter's illness. There was Raymond, a former mechanic who got injured on the job and was fired before he could qualify for benefits. There was Leon, a young man who had aged out of the foster system with nowhere to go, no family to call, and no one willing to give him a chance. Every story was different, but the theme was the same. The world had given up on them. As Shaq sat on the curb, listening to Raymond talk about how job applications required a home address, something he hadn't had in years, a thought took root in his mind. He had come here to understand, to see what life was like on the other side. But just understanding wasn't enough. He had to do something. His whole life, Shaq had been a man of action. He didn't just talk about problems. He solved them. And he was about to solve this one in a way that nobody would see coming. By the time he returned to the McDonald's, the place was quiet. Jesse was mopping near the counter, and Elena was wiping down trays. Shaq walked in, shaking off the cold, and took his usual seat. Jesse glanced at him. "You look like a man with something on his mind." Shaq smirked. "That obvious." Jesse leaned on his mop. "I've been around long enough to know when somebody's cooking up a bad idea." Shaq chuckled. "Depends on how you define bad." Jesse narrowed his eyes. "All right, let's hear it." Shaq exhaled. "This whole thing, the way people are treated out here, it's not just unfair, it's wrong. And people need to see it." Elena, who had been listening quietly, frowned. "People already see it. They just don't care." "That's because they're not seeing it the right way," Shaq said, his voice steady. "But what if we made them? What if we put it in front of their faces in a way they couldn't ignore?" Jesse and Elena exchanged a look. Shaq leaned forward. "I want to expose this. The way homeless people are treated. The way businesses kick them out like they're trash. I want people to feel it." Jesse crossed his arms. "And how exactly do you plan on doing that?" Shaq smirked. "By making sure the right people are watching when it happens." Shaq explained his plan. He wasn't going to just experience homelessness. He was going to document it, with hidden cameras, with social media, with a reveal so big nobody would be able to ignore it. Jesse let out a low whistle. "Man, you ain't just new to the streets. You're a whole different breed of crazy." Shaq grinned. "That a yes?" Jesse sighed, rubbing his temples. "I should say no. I should walk away from this. But damn it, I like chaos." Elena, who had been silent for most of the conversation, finally spoke up. "What do you need from us?" Shaq looked at her, surprised. "You're in?" She shrugged. "You're right. People need to see the truth. If I can help make that happen, then yeah, I'm in." Shaq nodded. "All right then. Here's what we do next." Over the next hour, they planned every detail. Jesse would keep his usual shifts, acting as if nothing had changed. He would be Shaq's inside man, watching how the staff and management reacted when homeless people walked through the doors. Elena, who had a cousin in journalism, would discreetly spread the word to local reporters. If they could get the right eyes on this, the story would explode. And Shaq? He would keep playing the role, pushing the limits, testing reactions, and getting every second of it on film. By the time they were done talking, the restaurant was nearly empty. Jesse stretched, cracking his back. "Well, if this all blows up, at least I'll go out with a bang." Shaq smirked. "Don't worry. If this works, you won't need to mop floors anymore." Elena rolled her eyes. "Just don't get yourself arrested." Shaq grinned. No promises. But as he sat back in his seat, feeling the weight of what they were about to do, he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about proving a point. It was about starting something bigger than himself. And once the world saw what he saw, they would never be able to look away again. Morning came with the same cold air, the same city streets, the same indifference from the world. But today, Shaq wasn't just another forgotten face. Today, the world was about to see everything. He walked toward the McDonald's, his breath curling into the air, his disguise still intact, tattered hoodie, scuffed sneakers, layers of dirt smeared into the lines of his face. But this time, he wasn't alone. Small cameras, barely noticeable, were positioned nearby. Jesse had set them up before his shift, tucked in corners where no one would think twice about them. Elena, off-duty but nearby, had tipped off a few local reporters, making sure they had a reason to be in the area. Everything was in place. Now all Shaq had to do was walk through those doors. As soon as he stepped inside, he felt it again. That shift in the air. Customers glanced at him, then quickly looked away, unwilling to acknowledge his presence. Employees at the counter exchanged glances. Kyle, the cashier from last night, visibly stiffened, his fingers drumming nervously against the register. And then, like clockwork, "Excuse me." Shaq turned. The district manager was standing near the counter, arms crossed, her expression just as sharp and unwelcoming as before. He had expected this. He wanted this. "You again," she said, exhaling like he was a burden she had been forced to deal with for too long. "Didn't we already have this conversation last night?" Shaq didn't answer. She sighed, stepping closer. "I don't know what part of you can't stay here. You didn't understand. But let me make it clear. You need to leave. Now." A few customers looked up from their meals. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others didn't bother to hide their amusement. This was the moment. Shaq stayed silent, letting the tension build. She scoffed. "Look, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but we don't—" Then, as she reached for his arm, Shaq straightened and pulled back his hoodie. The air shifted. The restaurant, once filled with the hum of conversation and the occasional clatter of trays, fell into dead silence. The district manager's face went pale. Kyle's mouth fell open. A man near the window let out a quiet, stunned, "No way." Because standing in front of them wasn't just some nameless homeless man. It was Shaquille O'Neal. Recognition slammed into the room like a tidal wave. People who had ignored him just moments ago were now leaning forward, eyes wide with shock. Phones were being pulled out. Murmurs turned into frantic whispers. And the district manager? She looked like she wanted the earth to swallow her whole. Shaq's voice was steady. "I came in here last night with $5 and a cup of coffee. And you treated me like I wasn't worth the air I was breathing." She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Shaq took a step forward. "You threw out a homeless man who was just trying to rest. You refused service to a veteran who had money in his hand. And you looked me in the face and told me I didn't belong here." The weight of his words hung in the air. Kyle, still frozen behind the register, swallowed hard. Jesse, standing near the mop bucket, stayed still, watching, waiting. Elena, who had been lingering near the door, quietly pulled out her phone and started recording. Shaq turned his gaze toward the customers, the people who had watched it happen, and said nothing. "How many times have y'all seen this happen?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Nobody answered. "How many times have people been thrown out just because they didn't look right? How many times have they been ignored, mistreated, kicked aside like they don't matter?" A man near the counter cleared his throat, shifting awkwardly. A woman stirred uncomfortably in her seat. Shaq's eyes landed back on the district manager. "What do you have to say now?" She opened and closed her mouth twice before finally stammering, I didn't know it was you." Shaq let that sit in the air for a moment. Then he nodded. "Exactly. Because that was the whole point. She didn't know. And because she didn't know, she had no problem treating him like nothing. But now she saw him. Now she cared. Because he was someone important. And that right there? That was the problem. The cameras were rolling. People were watching. And now? There was no undoing what had just happened. Jesse stepped forward, setting down his mop. "Guess that corporate training didn't cover this situation, huh?" The district manager shot him a glare, but there was nothing she could say, nothing she could do. Because this wasn't just a bad look for her. It was a disaster. Shaq exhaled, the weight of everything finally settling in. This moment, this was the start of something bigger. And now the whole world was about to see the truth. The moment Shaq pulled back his hood, the world shifted. A second ago, he was just another nameless man, a burden, an inconvenience. Now, he was Shaquille O'Neal. And that changed everything. The stunned silence inside the McDonald's only lasted a few seconds before the first whispers spread like wildfire. Phones were out. People were recording. And then, it exploded. By the time Shaq walked out of the McDonald's, his name was already trending. Within hours, social media had turned the footage into a sensation. Clips of the district manager berating him, of her telling him to leave, of her refusing service to a veteran. All of it went viral. Shaq Undercover. Homeless reality. We see you now. The headlines hit fast and hard. Shaq goes undercover as homeless. What he uncovered will shock you. Millionaire NBA legend exposes harsh reality of poverty in America. Homeless veteran refused service until Shaq stepped in. Every major network picked it up. News anchors replayed the footage on repeat, dissecting every second. The McDonald's district manager? She was fired before lunch. Corporate released a statement, carefully worded, claiming they do not condone discrimination and were reviewing policies to ensure a more inclusive experience for all customers. But the public wasn't buying it, because the footage wasn't an isolated incident. It was proof of a system that had been broken for a long, long time. And now, the world was finally paying attention. Kyle, the young cashier, reached out through social media, issuing an apology. "I was just following orders, but that's not an excuse. I should have stood up. I should have been better. I'm sorry." Jesse, meanwhile, was still working his shift when reporters started showing up at the restaurant. He mopped the floors like nothing had changed, until his manager called him into the office and told him he was being suspended for unauthorized filming. The story got out before he even made it home. The public outrage was immediate. The same people who had ignored Jesse for years were now demanding his job be reinstated. They flooded McDonald's headquarters with emails. They boycotted the location. By the next morning, corporate reversed the suspension and offered Jesse a promotion. But Shaq had a better offer. Shaq found Jesse sitting on the steps outside his apartment that night, still in his work uniform, staring at his phone. "You see this?" Jesse muttered, showing Shaq the email from corporate. Shaq smirked. "They scared. They know they messed up." Jesse shook his head, letting out a low chuckle. "I've been working there for 8 years, man. 8 years, and they ain't never offered me a raise, let alone a promotion. Now all of a sudden, I'm valued." Shaq leaned against the railing. "You taking it?" Jesse exhaled, shaking his head. "Nah, man. I'd rather clean toilets somewhere that don't need a scandal to appreciate me." Shaq nodded. "Good, 'cause I got something better for you." Jesse raised an eyebrow. "What kind of better?" Shaq grinned. "How do you feel about running a community center?" Jesse blinked. "Man, what?" "You got experience," Shaq said. "You know how to handle people. You know the streets better than most. I'm opening a resource center, job training, housing assistance, mental health support. I need a guy like you." Jesse rubbed his face, overwhelmed. "You serious?" "Always," Shaq said. "You in?" Jesse let out a long breath, shaking his head. "Hell yeah, I'm in." Shaq smiled. "Good. Now let's go find Elena." Elena was still working double shifts when Shaq showed up at the laundromat where she worked. She nearly dropped the basket she was carrying when she saw him. "Okay, no offense," she said. "But what the hell are you doing in a laundromat?" Shaq grinned. "Making sure you don't have to work here anymore." Elena frowned. "Come again?" "I saw what you did," Shaq said. "That night at McDonald's. You didn't know me, but you still made sure I ate. That kind of heart, that kind of kindness, the world needs more of that." Elena's eyes softened. "It was just a burger, Shaq." "No," Shaq said, shaking his head. "It was bigger than that." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to her. Elena opened it, her eyes widening. A full scholarship application, pre-approved. "Community outreach program," Shaq explained. "Covers tuition, housing, childcare, everything. If you want it, it's yours." Elena looked at him, stunned. "You serious?" she whispered. Shaq nodded. "Always." Elena pressed a hand over her mouth, trying to keep it together. Then, without warning, she lunged forward and hugged him tight. "You have no idea what this means," she said, voice shaking. Shaq smiled. "Yeah, I think I do." The next week, Shaq held a press conference. Standing in front of the cameras, he spoke the words that had been burning inside him since the first night he stepped onto those streets. "This ain't about me," he said. "This ain't about one McDonald's or one bad manager or one bad night. It's about all the nights. It's about the people who get kicked out of restaurants when all they want is a warm place to sit. It's about the mothers who have to choose between food and rent. It's about the veterans who served their country, only to be treated like garbage when they needed help the most." He took a breath, looking out at the cameras, at the world. I'm putting my money where my mouth is, he continued. I'm launching a nationwide initiative, housing programs, job training, financial assistance, not just a one-time donation, a real long-term solution. Reporters shouted questions. How much are you investing? Millions, Shaq said. And if it works, billions. The questions kept coming, but Shaq had already said what needed to be said. He stepped back, letting his actions speak louder than any headline ever could. The days that followed were a blur of movement, change, and hope. McDonald's launched a nationwide review of its policies, pledging to implement new training programs for its employees. Cities across America started talking about real solutions, not just shelters, but permanent housing, better mental health support, job placement programs. And Shaq? He was right in the middle of it. Not as a basketball legend, not as a millionaire, but as a man who had seen the truth up close, a man who refused to forget. And for the first time in a long time, the people the world ignored finally had something they hadn't felt in years. Hope. Shaq had always believed in action over words, but nothing prepared him for how much this experience had changed him. Before going undercover, he had thought he understood struggle. He had given to charities, built homes, handed out money to strangers in need. He had done his part, or so he thought. But now he saw things differently. He saw the cracks in the system, the weight of invisible rules that kept people trapped. He saw how one bad month, one missed paycheck, one stroke of bad luck could push a person off the edge, and how society made it nearly impossible to climb back up. This wasn't just about homelessness. It was about how easy it was for people to stop seeing each other as human. And he wasn't going to let that happen anymore. The morning after his press conference, Shaq went back to the streets where it all started. Not as a millionaire, not as a celebrity, just as a man on a mission. The first person he looked for was Miller, the veteran. He found him exactly where he expected, sitting on a park bench, staring at the ground, as if he were waiting for the world to forget him again. Shaq sat down beside him. Miller. The older man barely glanced up. Told you, new guy. You can't save the world. Shaq smirked. Number, but I can change yours. He handed Miller a folder. Inside was a full housing grant, medical care, and job placement assistance. Miller blinked at the papers, his fingers gripping the edges like he was afraid they might disappear. You serious? He asked, voice rough. Always, Shaq said. For the first time, Miller had nothing to say. He just nodded, swallowing hard, his hands shaking as he held onto a future he never thought he'd have again. Over the next week, Shaq made sure every person he had met got the help they needed. Tasha, the single mother. She and her daughter were placed in a fully furnished apartment, with job training to help her get back on her feet. Raymond, the injured mechanic. He was set up with physical therapy and a vocational program that matched his skills with steady work. Leon, the foster kid who had nowhere to go. Shaq made sure he had a home, a mentor, and a path forward. But it wasn't enough, because for every person he helped, there were thousands more still suffering. And Shaq wasn't about to let them be ignored. 1 month after his story went viral, Shaq launched the Full Circle Foundation, a nationwide initiative to fight homelessness in ways that actually worked. Not just food banks, not just temporary shelters, real solutions, affordable housing, job training, mental health services, legal aid, a system designed to help people rebuild, not just survive. And he didn't just throw money at the problem. He used his voice, his platform, his connections. He made sure lawmakers listened. He challenged corporations to do better. And most importantly, he kept showing up. Because the people on the streets had spent their whole lives being abandoned. Shaq was making sure they never felt invisible again. Months passed. The world moved on to the next big headline, but Shaq didn't. One afternoon, he was driving through town when he passed a familiar McDonald's. At first, he didn't think much of it, but then he saw him. Through the restaurant window behind the counter stood Jesse. But this time, he wasn't holding a mop. He was wearing a manager's uniform. Shaq couldn't help but grin. He pulled into the parking lot, lowered his window, and caught Jesse's eye. For a second, Jesse just stared. Then, he smirked. It was the smallest moment, but it meant everything. Because in that moment, they both knew. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. What you just read isn't just a story. It's reality for millions. The question isn't whether the system is broken. The question is, what are we going to do about it? Shaq used his voice to make a difference. Now it's your turn. Next time you see someone struggling, don't look away. Because change doesn't start with millionaires. It starts with moments. And this moment is yours.